Welcome back, everybody, and even if you don't have a body. I'm Layman Pascal, and I haven't spoken with Justin in a couple years. I think the last time I saw him, we were having nocturnal drinks and snacks on an outdoor restaurant patio in Victoria, BC, laughing wildly and passionately exploring the spiritual and philosophical implications of various interpretations of quantum mechanics in the multiverse. So I'm looking forward to our discussion and or our attitudinal hangout. Justin's got an integrally informed project called the Huddle, which makes him technically qualified to be on the Integral Stages Meta podcast, where I've apparently interviewed more Integral Game B, Meta Modern, and Liminal Web adjacent lunatics than anybody else alive. So if widespread second-tier integrative meta-level consciousness ever becomes a thing, I'll be remembered as a hero. Here to help me be that hero is another goddamn Canadian, Justin Robinson. Hi, man.
Hey, Layman, you are a hero. You're definitely a hero in my books.
All right. What is the last song you voluntarily listened to?
Oh, well, let me think about that. I'm not sure I could tell you, but the one that comes to mind is Sanctuary. Let me find out who it's by. Welshly Arms.
All right.
Let me tell you a little story about this song. So something that I have been doing in the last few months is spending some of my time on weekends sitting for people who want to do psychedelic healing journeys. And so I have to create playlists. It's one of my jobs for these journeys. So that song is one of the songs I put in the playlists.
I love something I like about that question. It's ambient and acoustic and personal. And it's the kind of stuff I wish people would start asking me when I'm being interviewed. Back on course, what the heck is a huddle?
Yeah, so my business partner and I were looking for ways to create some community. We have a lot of people that have been interested in what we're up to, and we want to share with them. So we decided to build this thing called the Huddle. And what it turned out to be was every Tuesday morning for 9 weeks in the fall and winter of 2021, we put together a show, and the show was sort of falsely marketed as a branding and business strategy and design show, and it was that, but we sort of went more into distilling some of the metaphors of the liminal web for people that had no exposure to it. And so it was really fun to discuss with a kind of an unindoctrinated and fresh group of people what it might mean to think about sense making and ambiguity and sovereignty in a time between worlds.
That sounds awesome. What did you hear anything back from these people that surprised you?
Yeah, I think what surprised me the most was the hunger for it. You know, I got a lot of texts like, something of the effect of, I've been waiting for so long for this type of discourse in my life. And, people found it really meaningful. And the other thing that was interesting to me is that everyone kept saying that it was a spiritual conversation, but we never directly invoked anything spiritual in the conversation. But for some reason, people found it that way. Mm-hmm.
It reminds me of there's a scene in Fight Club where the narrator says, "It was on the tip of everyone's tongue, but Tyler and I just gave it a name." I think there is a lot of people who haven't quite clarified to themselves that this is the kind of space, the kind of conversation, the kind of thinking they want to be in. But it's in so many people now. That spiritual thing is really neat. First of all, I want to be like, how do you know whether the content was spiritual or not? What's in your category spiritual?
Right.
At the same time, I know what they mean, because for me, like a good dialogos, that's church, or one of the churches, just like being in the deep woods or something like that. So I'm curious what your guesses are about which elements of the dialogue, which elements of the experience were the ones that gave people an experience that they reached for the word spiritual to describe.
Yeah, good question. I think there could have been lots of things, but I think one of the things is just this profound not knowingness of our time, the utter loss of the serviceability of many of the compasses and maps that we've inherited. I mean, if nothing else, it just demands some, I don't know what you call it, some other way of, it demands some kind of trust, some kind of like way of interacting with reality that, that can't be prescribed, or I'm not sure what I'm trying to say here, but that's one thing. Another thing is the truth telling. I mean, we had a lot of like senior C-suite level type of business people that came onto the call. And so it was very clear to me that those type of people are not going to stick around for, sort of basic points on, how to run a marketing campaign or something like that. Right. So I made the decision from the very first episode to just be very, very truthful about my own personal struggles and life and how I navigate through the world. And I think that people found that really refreshing. So that could be something. We also talked about topics like death. What does it mean to confront your own death individually, but also how does that sort of apply for civilization, for our species, for whatever we hold to be true as a collective in this moment. We talked about monsters as a sort of fun way. It was sort of like our Halloween episode, and it was a fun way for us to get into. My phone is doing stuff and it's coming onto my laptop, and I really don't want it to be there, but it's there. So I apologize for that. And so, so we talked about monsters and death, and what else do we talk about? Things like that. So maybe that had some spiritual sense for people.
Yeah. Wow. Each of those things. So the first part, what I hear is like an expanded notion of what being more present means, right? There's a classic spiritual way of being more present, which is actually very shallow. I'm going to show up without my mental narrative in the present moment. Okay, that's great. And that's a great start. But that's not all of what it is. It's showing up in relationship. It's showing up in the systems you're in. It's showing up with your body. And now more and more, it's showing up in the ethos, in the atmosphere of the time between worlds, which is disconcerting and apocalyptic and, like being at sea and not knowing where the land is anymore. So there's a real mindfulness practice to simply trying to inhabit that feeling and this moment that we're all in. And maybe it's not a moment, maybe it's the quality of the new epoch.
What do you mean by that?
I mean, we have a sense that, people who say the simple phrase is like back to normal. Oh, things are weird, but we're going to get back to normal. Or the smart way is it's a time between worlds. And we're like, oh, great. We're going to get to that next world somehow, right? We're jumping from one iceberg to the other one, but maybe not. If we are, it might take a long time. It might be that this moment is the next 500 years, or it might be that the next world that we're jumping to actually is permeated with time between worldsness, right? We don't know whether we're going over a hill and we're going to come down the other side, or whether we've gone up to a new plateau, and that's just how everything feels up there and is going to feel for a long time. So either way, we have to be we have to show up in that spirit and see what it's like in order to become like trying to live up on a mountain. You got to get used to the air somehow up there. I think I love your jumping right in with your own experience. Obviously, everybody knows authenticity is great, but there's something about, I want to say, the multidimensional invitation that people are hungry for. They want to hear from different parts of the experience of people. And not just all their positive experiences. They want to hear their negative experiences, their challenges, when the car goes in the ditch, all that kind of stuff too, which feeds right in with death and monsters, because we must all by now know that what we've been doing isn't working, right? A lot of great sounding strategies are not solving our personal or collective problems. And therefore, if anything is going to help, it must lie to some degree in the stuff we don't normally surface, what we normally marginalize and exclude in ourselves, personally and collectively. I think that's a real spiritual and religious function, right? We used to face humility and death and stuff through spirituality and religiousness. We used to face apocalypse and trauma and grief and loss and sin, the insufficiency of the human's ability to handle what's going on and to do the right thing all the time. So I think that is deeply religious, what you've brought in there.
Cool.
Yeah.
It was really fun. And it was also a lot of work to put on that first season. And it was kind of interesting because we weren't really sure we know what the point was, but from a business perspective, we weren't really sure why we were doing this. And we're still not sure, but we're going to do a second season. So we're going to kick that off on March 1st. And one of the things we've also decided to do is record a few pre-taped episodes with some interesting folks. And so maybe you'll join us for one of those at some point.
I would be thrilled.
Cool.
How do you, not being sure what the business purpose is, and maybe to some degree not being sure who the target audience is, how do you approach the aesthetic? How do you make stylistic choices?
Yeah, just so I'm clear on the question, just say a little bit more what you mean by stylistic choices. It sounds like something I should know the answer to.
Yeah, well, what's the, the way you put it together when you're building it, you're constructing it, and you're like, you're going to have shots, you're going to record a thing, you're choosing backgrounds, you're choosing people, maybe you've got music in there or whatever it is. You're creating an artifact for people to look at, and it's got some kind of mood to it. Right?
Yeah.
What mood is that? What are you going for? How do you decide? Well, we're not going to have clowns. Not going to play death metal, or am I?
Yeah, that's so interesting. So it's so interesting. So we have a full scale design agency. So we've got filmmakers and designers and writers, and that's our business. And yet this is all sort of just something that we can do a little bit in our spare time when we have an extra moment in our day to work on it. And so it's sort of just been people coming together and thinking like, okay, what kind of images might reflect a kind of blurriness, a kind of ambiguity. I think that was sort of the direction we went in the first season. And it wasn't really too much more thought to it than that. It was, yeah, I think we also wanted to keep it, it's 1 hour on a Tuesday morning. Our audience, at least so far, has mostly been entrepreneurs and executives. So we've wanted to keep it like, 1 hour, end on time, be kind of like exciting for people, have it be something where they're looking forward to it. So we want to keep it moving and be something that, they kind of have a sense of looking forward to starting their Tuesday with. That's about it.
There's a real Well, there's two strong sets of aesthetics that seem to be predominating in like podcast-ish space, let's say, right?
Mhm.
One is to go kind of clean and professional, but with smart, interesting content.
Mhm.
And the other one is like this Joe Rogan thing where you're just going to go long. It's going to be ragged and amateurish, right? I was watching Brett and Heather Weinstein, and the cat's always in front of the camera. You're just like, so those two are both in play. And I think going forward, everything's going to be a mix of those two,
Mhm.
depending on the audience, of course.
Mhm. Mhm. Well, it's interesting because I love to listen to the long winding, that's sort of my preferred podcast is I'll throw on, something with, the Weinsteins or, you and John Vervaeke chatting for 2.5 hours and just just enjoy it while I'm, running errands or getting something done. But it wasn't the direction we took, and we probably couldn't do that. We, just in terms of our schedules. Yeah.
Now, I don't have a question. I'm just thinking about the difference between these long form structures and the classic way that information's been presented to us over the last 50 or 100 years in these attractively packaged little news articles or sound bites, where the goal and the educationally instructed goal, where we all go to these schools and they teach us to make these things accessible and easy to digest. And you're like, man, you wonder what's being left out. Are they sabotaging our ability to do sense making by teaching us all that it's an ideal to have these nicely packaged, easily consumable pieces?
Right. Don't make people work. Don't make people work to consume content.
Nobody could possibly benefit from a deep, rich dive and adapting to complexity. That wouldn't be good for them. You mentioned leading psychedelic sessions earlier, and a lot of interesting questions around that. I guess a little bit of background then. What in your life led you to be interested in psychedelics, and who do you think of as a good thinker in that area?
Well, what led me to be interested in psychedelics was so beyond any experimentation that I'd done when, recreationally when I was, as a 17-year-old, it was kind of funny. I was looking for a way to align my professional livelihood with my sort of deeper, more truer commitments in life. And it was a time in my life when I felt that the two were very far apart. So I was exploring all possible ways that I might be able to do that. And I had a friend who I'd been working with who had done an ayahuasca ceremony 18 months before. And I saw that shortly after that, he left his job and started this clean energy company, and he was just going all over the world and doing these things that he'd always wanted to do. I was working in the oil business at the time. I kind of felt like it just wasn't my future. And so I asked him, I said, hey, did that ayahuasca ceremony, you changed everything right afterwards. Did that help you figure out what your path was going to be? And he said, no, but you should do it anyway. And he sent me to these folks, and that's how I got involved. That was in 2015. Actually, Layman, just shortly before I met you for the first time, a couple weeks, 2-3 weeks before I met you for the first time at the Integral Theory Conference in Sonoma that year. And I would have to say that maybe it was a combination of different things that happened over that summer for me, but it did kick off one of the most prolific and creative periods of my life up to this point so far. And so just recognizing the value in those experiences, I pursued them over the years and have been, more involved at some points. I did spend some time living in Peru with Shipibo elders, and then less involved at other points in my life. Now, who's a good thinker? That's a good question. because I guess I'm not sure who's a good thinker in that area at this point. I see a lot of interesting things happening. There's the guys like Jamie Wheel and everything, and the Recapture the Rapture, I think, is his latest, and all that stuff. But I don't really know if there's one. I don't know if there's one way of thinking about it that seems to make sense. It seems like it's just a really fertile, interesting, somehow feels important space right now. Yeah.
I think it's got, there's a couple of elements to it, I think, that make it very timely. One is, like I was saying before, we're all sort of sensing our strategies haven't been successful. And so we're reaching off the game board to see what else is nearby that we haven't integrated.
Mm-hmm.
I think these are, like the way Tim Leary thought about it, as these were re-imprinting tools that could kind of give you a new bit of personality, but that also means it's an educational tool. It can help get you up to speed on a situation. That's why it was experimented with for brainwashing these, right? You're going to try to update your thinking. But we're in such a strange situation now where we have to get updated thinking a lot. We can't wait for generational transitions to get on top of new information because the situation is moving too fast. But I also think there's something about the ontological flooding, the overwhelm, the uncanniness of the psychedelic experience that has something to teach us about the strangeness of the world moment that we're in. I think people who, you don't have to, but it's one good tool for helping people become more adapted to what this moment seems to be.
Yeah. And, I think we might have talked about this at some point in the past, but it's like, I don't know. I don't even really want to say this because who knows, but it is sort of consistent with this metaphor of a time between worlds, and that maybe, and the way in which developmentalists have really, I've seen like a very different discussion in the recent months about what does that all mean, and is the map even, in any way useful to us? And I've always wondered, like, maybe our understanding of the map works to a certain point, and then there's like a completely like origami refolding, totally, total alteration in the whole piece of paper in which the map is drawn, and the whole thing like comes out in a total surprise. And I can't, it doesn't really make sense to talk about this kind of stuff because it just makes the person who's doing it seem a little odd. But maybe there is something going on at this moment that psychedelics can really help to facilitate, where the whole construct of what this is and what we are is gonna turn itself inside out. Yeah,
it does seem like it's I think about the metaphor of the pole shift, right? These polar reverses that have happened throughout history, and it doesn't just flip. What happens is that the North and South Pole break up into several North and South poles and then slowly move over the surface of the world and pass through each other and slowly recongeal. Right. So that's very, it's easy to resonate with that metaphor for what's going on in the world today. I think there's something about it. There's something about the experience of the psychedelics is very much, I think you're right, like a time between worlds, right? It's a time between ways of being yourself. And it's not the only one. Sleep is like that. Spiritual experiences are like that. Deep, intimate experiences are like that. But there's something about it that's so elusive and so overwhelming and so out of control. You can't get on top of it if you go inside. And I think that's one of the things we need to viscerally understand in terms of how we hold these models. I think we definitely need good models. We need big picture theory. We need a lot of technological and socioeconomic systems improvement and a good map. And if we don't have a good map, all of our implicit understanding might never get locked in. On the other hand, that map is only one of the tools in our kit, and it can't predominate too much. It's always got to be framed by this sense of what we can't grapple with in our left brain, that we've got to go through in some kind of right brain mode. You got to live it out. And so I think we're seeing an urgent call from the artists and the psychoanalytic people and the dark renaissance and the hell meta-modernism and the psychedelic community, and the people saying, look, you're never going to get it done if you focus too much on the big map. You're correct. You're correct about what has to be done, but you can't do it that way.
Well, and the context of, the context for acting, if we're talking about developmental action logics, I don't know if it's right to say this, but it seems so different than it was 5 years ago, that none of it, there's just some piece, big picture wise, that just doesn't connect to a lot of the way that at least I used to hold those models.
I think about it in conversations I've had with people around UFOs. It seems like that. I mean, UFOs can be a very simple topic, like, are there or are there not these beings in these hardware ships? Fine. But there's something else about it that says, hey, your basic understanding of the categories of ontology is incorrect. I always use this metaphor of, like, spread the integral map out on a carpet, and there's like a mouse under the carpet, and there's just this bump moving around, and it's disregarding all the lines on the map. So there's something there, and you're like, that either breaks the map or forces the map to reorganize itself, or somehow just always has to be a complement to all the mapping we're doing. But one way or another, that factor is either something we get better at working with, or it's going to sabotage the entire attempt somehow. And I think people are, the more they've gone into the maps, the more they're seeing that risk. There's something could go wrong with this project, this beautiful idea, which we've been training on, looking at. It might fail if we don't find a way to include the thing that the mapping itself leaves out. And how do we do that? Right? Because that's the funny part, is we're asking ourselves to do something that we can't ask ourselves to do, because using the mapping part of our mind is the very thing we're trying to get outside of, right? So psychedelics and intense experiences are one way to do that. But I think that's what's so fascinating about this, about the anomalous character of the UFO, of the psychedelic, of whatever, the unconscious. We have to gain a skill at something that we can't say to ourselves how skill is gained in.
Yeah, it's funny, I just picked up the recent Ian McGilchrist's latest book. I just actually dove into it this morning, but I don't know, he's talking about what he thinks is the predominance of the right brain has been, really damaging to us and to reality. So sounds familiar, sounds similar to what you're talking about there.
I mean, I think his critique, and it's a little bit ambiguous as to whether this is all right brain, left brain stuff, but whether it's actual or metaphoric, there's some pattern like he's describing, and it's stretched over all of culture. And so, okay, we are left brain dominant in an unnatural way. It's supposed to be a little bit subordinate to the right brain to have the proper balance. We've gone too far the other way. So then the question becomes, what is the appropriate balance between these hemispheres? The naive initial response would be like, well, I'm just going to drop the left and go to the right, right? And you get some kind of unfocused, permeable, new age kind of approach, which brings in a lot of these other capacities, but loses the structure and can be easily co-opted, because maybe that opens you up to fascisms and all kind of other non-linear echo chamber ambient effects. If we're just going to go with mood, well, that might lead you to slaughter as well. Okay, so then what? Well, equal balancing. Well, how do we do equal balancing if they're not supposed to be exactly balanced? It seems like what McGilchrist himself is doing, which is what I would say Alan Watts was also doing, he's going to do a very competent left brain description of right brain patterning. You're like, okay, That's interesting. And maybe we should all be much better at using the left brain to describe how the right brain sees things.
Mhm.
But one thing that concerns me, I know I'm just rambling now, but it might be interesting, is that the totalitarian aspect of the left brain might be something it receives from the right. Right? That when we're poetic or prophetic, we can do that with an inaccurate sense of certainty. Right? The poet's like, this spoon, this morning, this person is everything. Right. And they have this tremendous amount of certainty that's almost verges on authoritarianism. Now they're making a beautiful statement of how the particular is the universal and we're in these fields, but there's a sense in which the right brain does speak with an incredible certainty about things. If you talk to the psychedelic prophet and they make a proclamation, it's totally believed in that moment. And the totality of that belief may translate from the master to his emissary, so that the left brain does the very thing the right brain does, which is totalizes itself. And if that's the case, how do we stop that, right? If you get a left brain critique of absolutism and totalization, then it has to hold itself in check, but it also has to do something to hold the right brain in check. And I think McGilchrist hasn't interrogated that well enough. The idea that the left brain has to make some kind of a stand against the right brain, right? You have to be able to say to the goddess, you're being crazy right now, right? Like you have to be, the emissary has to do his job well. And part of that is de-emphasizing the validity and the totality of the right brain to some degree so that they can have a more negotiated relationship. So I think that's a remaining piece, is what do we do with the strong linear mapping part in challenging the other part so that better negotiations can open up between them.
Mm-hmm. And how does this, how does this relate to the mouse under the paper? Say a little bit about that if you can.
These are, I'm taking the risk of sharing my half-formed thoughts that have just been going on my head this week. You've got to be able to interact with that mouse somehow, right? Like, first of all, it's a mouse. You can't just let it do whatever it wants. You have to appreciate what it's up to. It has a life there, but you can't let it chew through the carpet, maybe would be a way to say it. You can't let it sort of drag the carpet off somewhere. You've got to establish some kind of parameter based on the structure. The structure has to say, look, there are areas in which structure is valid, and there's a lot of shit you're saying, right brain, that is not applicable, even though we want to hear it. It's not necessarily the way you say it is. And if we can agree on that, we can establish a détente whereby the left will become much more willing to listen to the right, because the right will have more of its capacities and fewer of its self-sabotage modes. And the dominance of the left brain might be one of the right brain's self-sabotage modes. It might have set itself up to fail because it's got some nihilistic tendencies.
Yeah, I guess so. I definitely, that's part of the problem of the maps for me. And then this other part, and it might be related, is just the hesitation that I now feel about extrapolation. Like, any sense of, first of all, where this is all going, and second of all, that we actually could know what, I know you've been talking about education a lot lately, that we could know what capacities will be required in the future, and that we could, have a successful plan to educate for those. As much as I would love to hope that there's some truth to that, I feel very skeptical of it, now, much more than I used to. So. Yeah,
what's an education system that builds that critique into itself, right? Because there are some things we can extrapolate fairly well over the near to midterm, but there's a lot of stuff we just can't know. Like, what does the environment of the mid-21st century look like? I don't know. It's a time between worlds. Everything is getting more and more surprising and interconnected. And at some point, one of the radical shifts is going to break through. We don't know which one, and it might not even be one we know about. So the question becomes like a Nassim Taleb question, not how do you know the future and prepare for it? How do you prepare for a future you don't know about? Right? What are the anti-fragility skills that will make you most robust and adaptive and able to profit from circumstances that you cannot foresee? So the education system has to focus more on those kinds of general adaptation and strength building skills, which is sort of what it's been lacking historically, because we've mostly had education systems that pretended they did know what the situation was. How do you build one that pretends it doesn't know what the situation is? But I think we have some general ideas from things like complexity theory and Taleb and, shamanic experience, as well as the sense that we have to educate all the parts, since we don't know which parts we will need. We need to get better at generalized, multidimensional intelligence, collaboration, innovation, and adaptation. Those will probably serve us in good stead because we don't know what's coming.
Well, since you brought up shamanic experience, say a little bit about that, because that was actually our first ever recorded conversation. I think probably still on the internet somewhere.
Yeah, it might be. Okay. Well, I mean, shamanic experience is, I would argue, the privileged form of the spirituality of the future, which is to say it's the set, a generalized notion of shamanism is the set of skills that best maps to the set of challenges we think we're facing, right? It's spirituality that emphasizes embodiment, ecology, complex systems, non-human intelligence, altered states, improvisational ritual, interface between the human and non-human environments, the ability to draw useful information from other aspects of our lives, dreams, rituals, trances, things like that. So those all sound like an absolutely essential skill set for the era of the meta-crisis, right? Because we're looking at a problem of disembodied intelligence. We're looking at overlinear intelligence. We're looking at an ecological failure. We're looking at the difficulty in being productive of naturalness at the interface between the human and the ecological. We're looking at a whole bunch of missing information and motivation that's got to come from altered states of consciousness. We're looking at the absence of the rituals we need collectively to make a society function. So we need to be able to generate rituals. And these are all functions of the classic stereotype of the shaman.
Yeah, that sounds right.
And I would think the other part of it is the surrealistic part, which is unconscious intelligence. Right? Praveki and I have talked about this. He and Brendan and I had the discussion where we were talking about scaling up the religion that isn't a religion, and it's going to basically be founded on computational, collective, and unconscious intelligence, right? That the conscious calculating mind has an important role to play, but we have a sense of what its limits are. If we want to be able to go beyond the limits we currently have, we're going to have to draw upon sources of intelligence outside of that system. And the three main sources of those we have at the moment are increasing technological tools that simulate intelligence, some ability to get together and do collaborative collective intelligence that exceeds individual understanding, and some ability to harness the parts of our intelligence that don't come into our representational consciousness. So how do we make all of those three things smarter rather than just trying to make ourselves smarter at the expense of those things?
That last one is really interesting. I don't know if you're aware of a writer, Alexander Wendt. Anyway, he's a political scientist who wrote a book called Quantum Mind and Social Science. Actually, he wrote some other things, which he's much more well known for, and then he kind of went into the wilds of quantum social theory. But he says he makes the case that if minds are quantum phenomena, which he wants to say they are, that the unconscious mind is equivalent to the the wave function because it's always in a state of superposition. And as soon as you actually have a thought or have an experience, then something, particularizes. Like it's like there's a collapse, and then there's an experience of what it's like to be on the inside of the collapse of the wave function. That would be an actual thought. But that's only a very, very, very small percentage of what is happening, the information that's getting processed, and most of it we never are aware of. And so he equates that to the wave function. I'm curious if you...
Yeah, I think that's a very good, the way McGilchrist describes the right brain, right, is sort of ambient flux and field kind of experience. Now, that's also the way the McLuhan describes the transition from visual literate consciousness to acoustic digital consciousness. So it's not clear sometimes whether we're talking right, left, or we're talking different regimes of technology. But there does seem to be a sense in which one consciousness focuses on the particularized recognition of what it knows, and the other set of consciousnesses focus on mood-like ambient flux situations that are distributed and hard to articulate, and there has to be a transfer back and forth. Now, we're very often interested in getting that, how do I change my sense into something that's actionable? That's important. We don't often, I think through what it would take to send information the other way, because we treat the ambient as if it's just already knows what it's doing, rather than treating it as something that also has to mature and get smarter, right? So how do we not just go, hey, I've got an evolving conscious mind, but I need to benefit from this intuitive background understanding of the unconscious? How do I also make my unconscious evolve? Does it have developmental stages? It's the one I would really like to have get smarter and more spiritual, and I could just be its assistant. So is there a way, what do I do to be a good helper, to feed it information, to challenge it, to give it the things it needs in order to become something different than it is right now?
Interesting.
Yeah, I was just going to say you mentioned this guy was a political scientist.
Yeah.
So the question of how this plays out collectively is fascinating as well, right? Like, is one of the things I always say about Trump, that he has a certain kind of shamanic quality to him, right? He's not a bad one, he might even be evil, but there's something where the people are saying, what we need is a non-linear word cloud thinker who moves from instinct. And if you don't give us a good one, we'll choose whichever one we can get, because that's what we need right now. And you're like, oh, is that the voice of the collective unconscious saying that? Right? If we look at this, the trucker thing in Ottawa, right? Whether or not it's a good political move, or they're correct or they're incorrect, or they're forcing change or not forcing change, I think we'll look back and say this was kind of an expression of the unconscious of the Canadian spirit, trying to ritually enact something, and it doesn't necessarily know what it's doing. It's performing out of a half understood form of reality. So I think we need to extrapolate up from the personal unconscious, which is also understanding it better and challenging it to get smarter, and start to use that intelligence to look at what's going on collectively and read, as the shaman would, what the collective unconsciousness is saying and directing us to and asking for, and not just say from the point of view of the bureaucratic left brain consciousness that that's inapplicable. Because it might know more than you, or what can you do to help it become a smarter version of itself?
Oh, wow, that's really interesting. Yeah, I'm just thinking about Wendt for a second. I'm really curious what he would say about what you just said, but he does talk about the idea that the state itself is, we should think of it like as a wave function. It's a macroscopic quantum phenomena. And so you never see, I guess it's sort of like a hyper object. You never see the state. The only thing you ever see is in like, if you see a police officer arresting someone, you see an instance of the wave function collapsing in that moment, but you never actually see the state, because that's just the wave function. And so this is interesting what you said, though, because so the truckers we could think of that as a particularization of something, but of what is the question? What's actually collapsing there? Or is it a whole bunch of things? I don't know. Anyway, it's very curious, but I love what you said.
Yeah, he's right in the sense that whatever you think of, right? If you see the policeman, right, there's an unseen background that implies some kind of greater entity or organization, but you don't see that thing. And that's true of everything, right? Even this, I everything that I'm seeing right now through my eyes is just the tiniest piece of an implied background of electromagnetic flux that's just holographically congealing to look like this. So there's always that. At the same time, I think there's nation state is an interesting term because it implies these two sides, right? A nation is much more, I think, ambient, more like a flux, right? There's a people of some kind, and then there's a state system where it's very defined. We have X amount of money. We have these bureaucratic functions. We have this military control. We're delimited by these borders.
Sure.
And somehow we're not getting that balance correct. Like obviously, most states are argued over by several nationalities, and lots of nationalities don't have states. So there's some kind of missing balance, and it's very hard to think about how to get that balance right, because you either break states apart to more closely match nationalities, or you build a nationality to match the state. And both of those involve, well, one of them involves violence usually, and the other one involves breakup of systems. And so nobody wants to do either. And as a result, none of the states are operating as if they're nations anymore. Yeah, I strayed from that first topic a little bit, but I think there's something there about nation spirit, and about like when people feel collectively the spirit of the nation, that might be a reasonably good indicator that the two halves, what shows up in structure and the ambient background, are functioning well together. And when people are not sharing that spirit, this is a sign that there's some kind of relational problem between those two aspects.
Interesting.
Like here's a question for you. When was the last time you felt like there was a functional Canadian spirit? Do you feel like there is one, or do you feel like it ebbed away at some point? What's your sense of the history of that feeling?
Well, it's very it's very difficult now. I just was reflecting back to you may remember, when was this, around 1999 or something, when the Molson Canadian rant commercials were coming out. There was it was a much simpler time then, but thinking about it today, it's interesting because whether you want to call it the freedom protest or the terrorist illegal occupation of the capital, it's interesting because it's wrapped in the Canadian flag, and I think they've definitely hit a vein. I mean, I don't probably shouldn't talk about things like this on the internet, but I empathize. There's a certain, I land on that side of, freedom is very important to me. And so I feel it. I feel what they're feeling. And yet it's challenging because it's almost like we've kind of inherited or, taken on this polarized. Canada is not something I would normally think of as a polarized place. It's, and so all of a sudden we kind of feel like the US in the sense of there's a great divide between two very heated perspectives. And that poses a challenge for anything workable going forward, because if we are going to be a functional state, we have to take collective action together. And so I don't know if it's good or bad. It feels very messy at this moment.
Yeah, it's I think people are intrigued in part due to the complexity of it. Obviously, if I lived in Ottawa, I don't want a bunch of yahoos honking their horns and blocking me from getting my stuff done. But when they roll through Thunder Bay and I watch videos, shed a little tear for the Canadian spirit. I thought, oh, they're doing it, There's something beautiful about it, about just regular working class Canadians coming together to do something that they think is deeply patriotic. And you're like, well, that's definitely what we should be doing in principle, right? This is something like the largest mobilization of citizens in the history of our country. That's significant. It's not just, some fringe little thing. At the same time, what does it mean? What could it possibly accomplish? Right? Is it a sign of polarizations to come? Is it the case that centrist liberal bureaucratic institutions and centralist liberal bureaucratic media control by dividing and conquering, and that polarization is going to be here with us until the system completely fails? Or is there something we can do to repair this? Because one of the things that stands out to me is none of the major political parties attempted to absorb this energy at all. I think of absorbing grassroots upswells of energy as one of the main things that I expect from an actual politics, right? If you think of any time in history where a leader can be like, yes, I see you, I acknowledge you, I'm going to try to take you in and then steer you back into the shared experience somehow. I want to receive your energy so that I can be the leader. But all of our major political parties are like, no, we don't want to do any integrating of this. You're like, okay, that's a bad sign, right? Regardless of who's correct. The fact that there's no flexible assimilation instinct in the system is worrying to me.
Interesting. So you didn't, because I'm curious, because as I looked at it, I felt like, and there might be a difference between, appropriation and integration, but I felt like the Conservative Party was attempting to do what you said, but you didn't see that. That wasn't.
I haven't seen it prominently. That's who I would think could make this move. Although I would love if the NDP or the Green Party could make this move and give themselves the extra energy they need to be a real player in the system. The Conservatives are the ones you would naturally look to. That's what echoes the American system. Jordan Peterson's been trying to call out to conservative politicians to do that, and they were in the middle of a leadership switch federally. So that's who I expect, but I haven't seen it strongly. I've more seen the slow defection of liberal MPs starting to change this thing.
Right.
There's a little bit of it, but what bothers me is how little there is. That this isn't the normal stance of politics to say, hey, there's a lot of energy, a lot of people, a lot of feeling. Let's bring that in and absorb it and enrich ourselves. When I was a kid, here's where I fell in love with the Catholic Church. When I learned they moved Jesus's birthday to accommodate pagan celebrations, I thought, yes, that is the right move. That is truly religious, right? You took all that spiritual energy and absorbed it and orchestrated it. Now it's yours and everybody's together. Perfect move, right? It's unclear what exactly that move correctly consists of in any given circumstance. But you either have the attitude that we should be absorbing, or you have the attitude that we should be purifying, right? Like if you were the German government in the 1920s and 30s, you take this attitude of like, look, there's too much messiness here. The way we're going to solve that is start removing messy groups, right? Get rid of the Jews, get rid of the Slavs, get rid of anybody with a mental handicap, get rid of any provocative artists. We're going to backtrack until we have a simplified homogeneity, and then we'll be able to relax. The problem is you're cutting off your own limbs in the process. You're getting weaker and weaker and more nihilistic and self-destructive if you do the Puritan move. The opposite of that is, how can we absorb more? But we don't really have an absorption. We don't really have an increase mentality. Like our nation's hospitals are woefully inadequate. The fact that we can have a little pandemic bump and go, holy shit, our hospitals are overloaded. You're like, why don't we have extra hospitals? Why didn't we make new ones? What new hospitals have we made since the pandemic started? Yeah, like none. We decided to hold back, hunker down, do less, right? We chose a less rather than a more solution. It's not growth oriented. It's frustrating to me.
Interesting.
And I mean, international or even extraterrestrial in my sentiments. A lot of what I see, what's going on, I just think, oh, that's strange. Look what the humans are doing. But at the same time, there's a little patriotic kid in me,
Sure.
a flag waver. You know what I mean? And I want that to be there. I think clean, strong nationalism is an important part of moving the system forward, and an important signal that the conscious and the unconscious pieces of the population are working well together. And I don't see that being enacted almost anywhere.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, it's interesting. To speak from an integral perspective for a moment, the solutions to the pandemic have all been in the on the right hand side, which is sort of, I guess, what's expected in our world, as screwed up as it is. But I've been very conscious. This is I think why I really feel the truckers is I've just been, I've seen so many people around me have their lives become worse because of and not just a little bit worse, but, in some cases, very much significantly worse because of these mandates and restrictions. And it just seems like a failure to see the forest for the trees in terms of the response that was, and the policy that was enacted. And so I just wonder, like, what a better type of response would be, or
yeah. And that's so hard to know. Like when we actually look at the objective part, you're like,
yeah,
this is different. I mean, the trucker thing as symbolic and as opposing mandate, you're like, okay, fine. But, did we do the right thing with vaccines? Did we do the right thing with vaccine passports? Obviously, we don't want people to die. So even though it would have been nice if we built in excess healthcare capacity, we've got to deal with the fact that we don't have that. So we've got to keep people from overloading the system. So we've got to flatten the curve. You're like, okay, well, that all makes complete sense. And we do need to always be thinking that we may have to adjust our sense of rights in order to accommodate the well-being and health of other people. But the limitations in the external approach, combined with the failures to accommodate the internal approach, have been really glaring. I think one of the things that leads people to the truckers and has, I think, drawn a lot of people who might otherwise be progressive toward a conservative side on this is they're looking for an internal embrace. They want to hear that their freedom and their sense of the nation are preserved, and that collectively they're not going to be treated as an underclass, that they're going to be intersubjectively met as equals. Right? So that's been ignored. And then externally, right, there's tons of therapeutic things that we lied to each other about, doubled down on particular types of solutions and tried to apply them across the board rather than prioritizing, rather than consistent messaging, rather than saying, here's all the things that might help. We narrowed right down on one kind of commercially incentivized one-size-fits-all solution. And that doesn't seem to be a smart way to handle the externals. Right, the smart solution would have to be more complex and more flexible than that. And I think the worrying thing, although it's a classic human thing, right? A lot of people talk like these problems just emerged. What's emerged is it's always been like this, that people even smart professional people in bureaucracies designed to help people give themselves the right to oversimplify and lie to us when public health is the issue. And we absolutely have to make sacrifices for public health, but they don't get to lie or oversimplify or push stuff off the table in order to do that. And the fact that they give themselves that right, and anyone who doesn't agree with it in the moment is somehow problematic and worthy of suppression, is a real danger both to practical health outcomes and to the shared spirit.
Totally. Sure. Yeah. The scientific spirit of always questioning and inquiring that stops when public health starts. It's like once public health decides what they're doing, it's no more questioning allowed.
Definitely. No, and you're like, I get, of course the science is evolving. Of course the science is evolving. But if you're looking back and you're like, oh, we were censoring a lot of people for mentioning things that the science turned out to validate down the road, we might have been handling this whole science is evolving thing incorrectly. Like, I don't know if we can tell the difference between what the science is and what's the current bureaucratic consensus. And if we can't tell those apart, there's a real risk in managing any kind of crisis, and many more bigger ones are coming. Right? This one it's bad. People are dying, but it's not nearly what it could be. Right? In my mind, it's always the next one is going to be, imagine it 5 times as deadly and 5 times as transmissible.
Absolutely.
That's conceivable in the near term. So are we ready for that? No, we're not even close to ready for that. So then how do we, right? How does the liminal web leverage itself? Because so many smart, artistic, creative, really informed, multidimensional, fairly grounded, adaptive, evolving human beings. How do we leverage ourselves to become ready for the unreadiness that's coming? If it's clear that we're not collectively preparing, then we need to prepare for that unprepared reality somehow.
Yeah, well, that's interesting. That's the I don't know. Is it possible? I don't know. I mean, I love what you said, in response to this question. How could we even know what capacities we need to educate for? You went to Nassim Taleb, and I thought that's actually brilliant and the right way to think about it. But I still don't know if that gap is ever surmountable. I'm very skeptical, Layman.
Well, I think there's a way. Here's then the mapping part comes on. You go, yes, exactly. What you just described is a shape on the map, right? Because the absolute incompleteness of the ability to determine what's going on has to be a major component of the system that we're putting forward, right? Yeah. It can't be just, we know these things are necessary for adaptation to uncertainty. There's also the uncertainty about whether anything we're doing can actually approach what's really uncertain. So let's build that in as one of the modules. So that's my left brain structural thing. And I think that's really important because it does galvanize it. But at the same time, it shifts a little bit away from the lived experience of what it's like to approach that threshold of informational opacity, or these are the patterns your brain literally cannot process.
Yeah. Well, and maybe that does open a window for me to a certain form of spiritual thinking or experiencing, which is that I'd heard someone talk about this on some podcast or something, but in the movie Don't Look Up, where everything's finished, the asteroid's going to hit the planet, and you see the scene of them having dinner with each other, and it's that's the sort of question I'm left with. Yeah. When I look ahead into this very daunting and uncertain future, it makes me think, well, okay, how do I actually want to spend whatever time I have left? Yeah. Which I don't know how much it is, and I don't know what it's going to be like, but is there a priority that I might have been missing? Like, is there a way of being that actually, if I think about it, is more important to me that I haven't been emphasizing? Is there people that I want to be with? Is there, the time? I'm left with the sense of time and being itself is just a freaking precious miracle.
And that's always been part of the spiritual and developmental conversation, right? The authenticity and the clarification of meaning and values that comes from the confrontation with the fact that you are going to die and be destroyed, and so is everyone you love. Like, that's always been the case. It's compounded now by the sense of mass meta level mega destructions, or radical transformations that might feel like destructions. But essentially, there's some kind of wisdom about facing absolute limit, right? That kind of Heideggerian confrontation with the end of all your possibilities that forces your authenticity. And we have to take that seriously. So then there is, after the ayahuasca trip, go for a cheeseburger or whatever it is. You're like, okay, we're back. We're still here. Everything just got ripped off, but for some reason we're still here. What do we want to do? And that's a beautiful question. But analytically, I think we want to look at a subset of those things that might also be productive for the situation, right? So if we all were clear, hypothetically, through various processes and experiences of what things would give us value, even if we were absolutely doomed, then which of those activities are also likely to decrease the possibility of doom, right? We're narrowing the target space. But if we could amplify those things that serve both those functions, we're at least making a good gamble.
We can look back at the end of our lives if we get the opportunity to do that and say, oh, we probably, the world is better off because we were here.
Yeah. And I mean, on the one hand, every effort is doomed.
Right.
On the other hand, you've got to make efforts. So which ones?
Well, but so that's the question I've been grappling a lot with lately. And I mean, I've been thinking about this for a while because, I wrote my master's thesis on sustainability leadership. And, if it is true that every effort actually is doomed, if Jem Bendell is correct, if it's inevitable, the collapse of the whole thing it's just a question of when, probably sooner than we think. I don't know if that subset that you described seems that appealing to me anymore. I get a little lost. I kind of think the answer, if there is any answer, it's going to be so far outside the box that I would rather just spend my time focusing on consciousness and the transformation of consciousness than, get lost in, should we plant more trees over here? And, let's make a exhaust pipe that is, 6% more efficient or whatever. Like, it seems like a way that I don't want to spend my time anymore.
Yeah, no, I can resonate with that for sure. My fear is that I'm talking myself into not doing the things that might actually help, that I'm letting myself off the hook, that I'm not picking up the burden of my responsibility, and that I, like all other beings, are subject to a nihilistic regress, right? You go, well, maybe there's a reason for me to give that up and give that up and give that up. Pretty soon I'm just in a room by myself and might as well die, right? It's a slow suicide. And so where is it the case that I should be drawing down to what my heart says, which is just focusing on my relationships and my spiritual life and my immediacy with the world? And where is that concealing a set of self-undermining dangers? I don't know. And we can, I think when you zero into yourself, you go, okay, I've got to prioritize this one way or the other. But then you zoom back out a little bit and you go, well, still, I haven't died, so I've got to arrange to have food next week. And then you zoom up back, you go, well, the world is actually still here. I maybe should take that seriously. So it depends what our focal point is, how closely we zoom in, what quadrant we look at, things like that. They're all in play, but I think our sense of what the balance is might be shifting lately. But I think knowing that we're doomed is the precondition for optimizing efforts to change the world that don't sabotage our ability to inhabit the world, whether it can be changed or not.
Say that again, slowly.
Okay. I don't even remember what I just said. like accepting doom is, I think, a precondition. Emotionally integrating that is a precondition for being able to viscerally calculate the balance so that you can make efforts to change the world, knowing that it may or may not be improvable. And that those efforts can take the form of any scale. I mean, you can only deal with what you're confronted with. If your mind confronts you with systems, if somebody puts the levers in your hands, you go, oh shit, I got to make a good decision about that. If on the other hand, it's you at dinner or you with a lover or you in meditation, then that's the situation in which you have to do that. And you have to do that knowing it may or may not succeed. And your ability to really be present for that reality, I think, is dependent upon us taking into ourselves deeply the possibility and the reality of doom. Otherwise, the risk is we haven't really shown up to the situation, and that all our good ideas might be useless and fail. So that's what I'm doing. It's like I'm tying the two options so closely together they can't be pulled apart, which, I mean, gives me a sense of security and a certain position in conversations.
I find myself wholeheartedly agreeing with what you said. And even thinking about the pandemic, I think it would, if our policymakers and public health, people were thinking, if we all embrace doom, it'd be interesting to have a conversation about how to go forward. If we could rewind 2 years ago and start from that point of view, let's talk to these people who are in their 70s and 80s with comorbidities and ask them how they want to live the, rest of their life, which probably isn't that long. It would be an interesting, it would be very interesting to start from that point of view.
There's so much. I mean, I've been trying to encourage this project I call Ontario depth adaptation.
Okay.
Right? So it's like Bendel's deep adaptation. But the word depth signifies the attempt to enfold in kind of liminal web communities.
Okay, cool.
Right? Because one of Bendel's questions is like, what would you want to save? Okay, so what would I want to say? Well, I want to save integral and meta theory and game B and like all this stuff, the dark renaissance. These, I think, in my heart, these are the best people and the ideas that we would need if we were going to reboot a civilization. Right. But the gap between those people and between people who are actually preparing seems huge, right? Like why aren't half of the people in the liminal web why aren't the people in the web spending half of their time trying to work out how we would actually feed ourselves and keep each other alive when something goes down? Right? And the reason I put the Ontario in there is because I want everybody to foreground bioregional thinking. Because this is great unless the internet goes away or if the border closes. What if the border closes for 20 years? Right. Well, then all my friends in Austin, that's useless to me. They're not going to help me survive. I got to figure out how to work here. And everybody has to think what they would do in their actual embodied region, but think it in a way that will work to improve things if the system holds and survive with maximum thriving advantage if the system goes down. And I think in order to do that, we have to take the system failure probabilities much more seriously than we are. Because the thing I've noticed about this project, it's new, I'm just trying to promote it and get it started, but it's hard. I don't do it, right? How much of my time is spent really trying to figure out how I would heat this house if the gas stopped flowing, right? Almost none of my time. And yet that's clearly a more important problem than, how we scale up the religion that isn't a religion. So making that shift or giving it at least 50% of the time seems huge. Right. And that's a similar question to what we were just talking about, is how do you live in a way that is viable if you can't control it, but also helps you think that you're improving something potentially? How do we set up preparatory systems that are also immediately valuable systems that we would want to spend our time with if things are doomed or if they're not doomed? And it's just nobody knows the answer, and nobody knows how to get into the emotional situation to be motivated to move to the spot where those things are convergent.
Mm-hmm.
So that's the question I'm setting before my own heart.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Could I just ask one? It's sort of a departure, but you did invoke the liminal web and game B and the dark renaissance and everything, and there's
it's a fair segue.
Okay, good. And you're such a huge part of this. I mean, there's a massive cross-pollination of ideas, and it's such a flourishing of all of these really fascinating, very delicious perspectives converging, and who knows what's going to happen when the dust settles after everything is collided. But what do you make of all that? Like, what's, and maybe specifically in terms of this question of everything we've been exploring today, if I'm allowed to ask a question, is like, what's the, yeah, but like, what's the, how is this all going to contribute to our resilience and capacity as a species? Or like, where does it, is there some end game that we're all playing for as members? I don't know if I'm a member, but I wish I could be a member of that liminal web. Like, how does that all
Sure. To be in the liminal web, you have to be adjacent to the liminal web.
All right.
Yes. I mean, we don't want to go too far into specifying what the end game might be, but the way I see it is the position of the world is calling forth certain idea systems, and those idea systems have attracted people, and those people are naturally attracted to other idea systems that are similar. Mm-hmm. So you end up with communities of these overlapping idea interests that are they're nominally defined by the idea sets, right? Oh, it's integral theory, or we're Gebsarians, or I'm really into Greg Henrique's work, right? And I think the overlap and the conversations are becoming so fluid that those distinctions are breaking down. Uh-huh. And so you're seeing on the one hand an attempt to name it, and which is great because I don't have to list 10 overlapping communities. I can just say liminal web. But on the other hand, you're getting an organic specialization. Organs are forming, right? Mm-hmm. So it's not so much about whether you're integral or game B. There's the people who lean more toward the spirituality and the people who learn more toward the techno-social, or the people who are more interested in the political or more interested in the artistic and psychoanalytical. So I think we're starting to see the natural sub-organs of this system, and those all have to function together somehow. And the more conversations we have, but especially the more people who are able to go into each of them and in themselves generate the feeling quality that's broadly shared, or that could be the integrative feeling quality for all these. That's the immediate telos of this. We need to generate more people who have that heart quality that goes between them. And those people have to form a kind of liminal web core that can allow these different groups to have their complementary specializations. Mm-hmm. And then when we look at what those complementary specializations are pointing to, they're actually very convergent. Even though initially they're going to focus on the points of divergence, that's in service to complementarity, I think. Right? There's a beautiful conversation with Owen Cox and Brenna Graham Dempsey and Fraga the other day. And all right, they're pointing at this game B meta modern vision, then going, look, it's too tidy. What you're saying, things yet can't quite go that way because you're neglecting the darkness, the uncertainty, the death, the sexuality, the conflict. It's not juicy enough, right? But if you listen to the conversation unfold, they don't have a problem with any of that directionality. They actually agree with it. Yeah. What they're saying is, in order to attract artists and attract more people, and in order to really engage it, you've got to go through more darkness in yourself. It's got to be more psychoanalytic, more authentic, more lean into the breakdown rather than the inclusive, integrative, tidy up version. So once you say that, you go, oh, they're talking procedure and these guys are talking overview. right? They actually agree on the same goal, which is not a known goal, but it's a directionality. Okay, you start sifting through all of these emergent subgroups and think of them as complementary, then I really see a strong convergence and a single directionality, although it's a complex and rich directionality. And I think it's best represented by the dialogues between members of the different specializations and by what seems like a small handful of people at the moment who are feeling the blended quality of all of them. So that's where I could say where I think we need to go next, but I think that's where we are right now. And I think there is a directionality to it. I'm willing to gamble on that directionality. Whether it saves the world or not, who knows? But it's plausible that no other type of community could.
Mm-hmm.
And it has the thing like I was saying before, it's so satisfying
Yeah.
that it's good even if it doesn't work. I made this meme last week with like the drowning hand, and the liminal web just gives it a high five and it sinks into the water, right? So that's partly a critique that we're a little bit, there's an insufficiency in what we're doing, but there's also like even if it doesn't work, high five. Like it worked in the immediate, even if it didn't work overall, and it might work overall.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yeah, I love that sort of placeholder of we're not sure how, but in some ways we have an idea and this might work. I love it. I love it.
If it was guaranteed the world was ending in a week, I'd still want to talk to you.
Yeah. Oh, I love it. It's great. Me too. Feelings mutual, Layman.
And there's something about the way conversations like this go that is like the way the relationships between our internal systems go when our meditation or spiritual practice or health practice is working well.
Mm-hmm.
That's integrative flow to create an excess surplus, which gives us a sense of meaning. And ultimately, that's all we can do. But we can try to do that in ways that might really improve things, whether they do or not.
Mm-hmm.
Well, that was pretty good.
Yeah.
Is there anything else we should talk about, or are we just about done?
I don't know. Let's maybe this is the place to end, and for now.